Well, hello and welcome to episode 14 of the Wright County Restoration Project podcast. My name is Jamin.
And my name's Sam.
And we are back, and today we are talking about the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. So Jefferson is a well-known figure well before he becomes president of the United States.
Absolutely.
As a matter of fact, for quite some time, we've seen that the figures that have become the president have had many other very influential parts to their career, so much so that you might even subjugate their presidency to many other portions of their lives and of their influence, Thomas Jefferson probably being one of those. When we think about his influence as it relates particularly to the Declaration of Independence, we can imagine that the presidency, although quite consequential, is maybe not the most consequential thing that he engaged in as far as his contribution to American history.
Very true. Very true. And he, even during these early years, the president's role wasn't nearly as influential either. It was an important picture of a head of government to the world and someone to make some of these executive decisions, but it was definitely something that wasn't as big a deal as it is today, as we see, and with Jefferson in particular, he didn't hold it in that high regard either, except the fact that he wanted to be president. He definitely felt that Washington and Adams, who came before him, took it a little bit too much. They were too much into the pomp and the ceremony and elevating that role. And Jefferson, if you really look at it, he kind of brings it down. He's kind of a common man president. He just kind of rides in on his own horse and does his own thing, and he opens up his table with just plain food. Anybody can stop by and eat with the president. It was a very different view that Jefferson had of the American people and of what the presidential office should be.
And we would have expected that in that President Jefferson was the first president that was not a Federalist.
Yes.
And so we see that the first two presidents had a very strong view of federal power, of the united government, whereas Jefferson was a Democratic Republican, and so he was significantly more a states' rights man. And we would see, even from his inauguration day, where Washington and Adams came in by carriage, and there was that pomp, and yet he comes in on his horse. He walks in, and he does his thing. So we would see from very early on that there's a different tone to Jefferson's presidency as it relates to the way that he relates himself to the office, and even would see the office specifically as it would relate to the states' rights and the importance to him of a small federal government and a relatively powerless federal government.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, and something that I'll maybe touch on a little bit, but if you are interested in this part of history, really recommend you look at this election of 1800. It's interestingly, and at the time of this recording, we're just coming out of the 2020-2021 elections, and needless to say, they were tumultuous. There were many things going on, many different points of view, and a lot of people are fairly dissatisfied still at the way things turned out. This isn't the only time that's happened. In the 1800, they actually called it, Jefferson kind of dubbed it the 1800 Revolution. Things really got strange. There were many different moving parts, and it's a little hard to follow because the way people were elected was a little different.
Right.
It wasn't by the vote of just the general public in the states. It was by state legislatures picking electors, and it was kind of an interesting mix. But you had states like Virginia change their where instead of each elector kind of getting to pick what they could do, they basically locked in and said all our electors are going for one person, which we see today is the way it works. But this was
in many states.
In many states, but this this was a brand new thing. And because Virginia really wanted their son, Thomas Jefferson, to get in, they said, we're sending them all this direction. And so that was a last-minute change that a state made that definitely shifted things.
Yeah, so states are making last-minute changes to their normal operating procedure in order to bring about the result that they wanted in the election.
Very much so.
Similar to what and we wouldn't necessarily see that overtly today, although there were many last-minute changes to policies as it would relate to electoral votes and mailing in ballots particularly, in order to accommodate a very strange year in 2020.
Yes. And we also see the very similar things in the way that they pick their vice presidents. Now, the vice president was really, in the end, the person that got the second highest electoral vote.
Right.
That's why Thomas Jefferson is the VP of John Adams, who was just in for one term, and we just talked about him.
Because they were actually competing with one another for the presidency, and because Jefferson got the second highest number of votes, he naturally slotted into that vice president spot.
Right, and he actually only got knocked down to vice president by like 2 or 3 electoral college votes. It was a very close thing, and that was something. So Jefferson had been in. He was also in Washington's cabinet as a part of that as well. But Jefferson definitely held a very different point of view on these things, as far as, and we talked about him being what we call a Democratic Republican, a man of the rights of the states, and not as much in favor of a centralized figurehead as Adams and Washington definitely were, being more federalist. And we also see something that was similar to our most recent election in Aaron Burr. Aaron Burke shows up on the scene, and why do they pick him as a vice president? Why do they pick Charles Cottonworth Pinckney as vice president running with Adams? The reason is, and this also pertains to why certain vice presidents get picked these days, is because they needed the states that those men were from. Burr was an influential New York politician, and Pinckney was from South Carolina. Both states that the Adams campaign, as it were, and the Jefferson campaign both felt like they needed. Pinckney was a good man, but he was, because of some of the ways he worked things out, he wound up hardly any. I don't think any of the electors from South Carolina actually went for him and Adams, which was kind of an oops on his part. But Aaron Burr was much more successful, and in fact, he became so successful at what he was doing that he winds up getting the same number of electoral votes as Jefferson does. And part of Burr's success is through he mobilizes a big get out the vote campaign in New York in the areas that are predominantly a lot of immigrants. And he shifts a lot of New York's legislature over to being these Democratic Republicans, which we now know as, morphs into the Democrats of today, though things have really changed. It's hard to match these groups up on what they actually are going for. But he makes his big get out the vote campaign, as it were, and he gets in there. And yes, it does come down to a decision between, and it winds up in Congress. And
an electoral vote tie between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson.
They both have 73 votes, 73 electoral college votes, and it goes to and then each state gets one vote in this thing. And this was kind of interesting because it was something fought about at the Constitutional Convention way back before this, because the little states were like, hey, if we don't have a say in this thing, if it's a population thing, the big states, which in this time was Virginia and Massachusetts, are going to get their guy in all the time.
Right. So if if every representative was allowed to vote in the House of Representatives to break this tie, which was talked about in this election as well when people were considering the possibility of it being a close election in 2020, if there were to be a tie, the House of Representatives would break that tie. But as we've learned before, the House of Representatives is decided, the number of people in the House of Representatives per state is decided by population.
Yes.
So if you have a very large populous state, you have more representatives in the House of Representatives, and you have an undue amount of power as it relates to deciding the president in one of these situations.
Right.
So instead, they only allow one vote per state. So the House of Representatives from that state has to come together, choose a candidate, and make their vote for a candidate within the House of Representatives, a singular vote for each state.
Very much so. And what happens is they go round and round. They can't get the election, the enough votes in Congress to make this thing happen. They go about 30 times around. It's a very divisive thing, and the Congress itself is mostly Federalists, and it's a lame duck session. A lot of them are going to be voted out, and so it's very interesting. And in comes Alexander Hamilton, who's another New York politician, but he's a Federalist. He's an ultra-Federalist. He's even a little more on that side than he opposes some of the things Adams did with the various acts, the Sedition Act, and those things that we talked about in the last podcast. If you didn't listen to that one, and you'll get a little more info on what those things were. But Hamilton was more interested in a federal banking system, which was kind of interesting, and we won't go into that either. But he pushed ahead and really lobbied for Jefferson, and he just didn't like Burr, and they were kind of from the same area. Which makes sense, rival politicians from New York. Right. And so and Hamilton was a very influential man. He's probably, him and like Benjamin Franklin are some of the few that didn't become presidents, but were some of the founding fathers that were very influential. And so that happens, and thus after the 36th ballot, Jefferson is finally his presidency is secured. Burr becomes vice president because he gets the second most votes, and it finally goes through. The interesting thing is, and this may sound familiar to you, so in this balloting and all of this going on, speculation arose about what might happen if the election had not been decided by March 4th. March 4th at this time was when Inauguration Day happened. It hasn't been that for a while, but back in these days it was. And then it says, when by law a president was to be inaugurated. Rumors swirled of assassination plots, arson schemes, military preparations, revolution, and possible civil war. So there were swirlings of fake news and conspiracies, and so-and-so's trying to take this, and Adams trying to change things. And it was a very interesting time, and you can maybe kind of understand why I liken this to our most recent election, because it was a very tense time in a very new, young United States, and a lot of people weren't sure. Yes, these are the rules, but how do they play out when we have a nation and different political parties that were very divided and very divisive? Yeah, so this is important for us to think through, and we'll talk about this at various other times and various other elections, but we can get this idea sometimes, and history does this, right? History kind of makes heroes out of people and romanticizes things, and we get this idea that the founding, everyone was so united, and they had this purpose, and they were willing to die for this, and they were. Yes, for sure. And they created this new nation, and then George Washington, and as we studied a couple of weeks ago, George Washington most certainly was a uniting figure. Nobody wanted anybody other than George Washington to be the president of the United States. Right. He ran unopposed. Mm-hmm. They all chose him. They chose him, and they would have chosen him for a third term if he'd have gone for a third term. And yet right after that, things start getting quite messy. We've got differing ideologies. We've got people fighting, bickering. We've got very strong campaigns of slandering people's, trying to slander people's reputations, dragging people's reputations through the mud, a tremendous amount of infighting. We're talking sedition, civil war talk, all of these things. And all of this is 15 years into the whole process, and it's a good reminder, particularly with American politics. And we might see, things are a little bit different in various places. British politics has always had a veneer of civility about it and such. Not so much in American politics. Mm-hmm. It's always been kind of a wrestling match, down and dirty in the mud. And what we have experienced is definitely unique in 2020 as it would relate to historical elections.
2020 being a very unique year.
Yes.
But we might not anticipate that what we saw in 2020 will become the new normal. We might not anticipate that what we saw in 2020 was even necessarily outside of historical precedent as it relates to how dirty and confused and slanderous and everything else that we saw. Power is power, and power plays happen. And not to try to lessen any of the egregious nature of what happened, but maybe simultaneously, this isn't the first time we've seen it.
Yes, and we've seen not only this particular election, the 1800 election, but other elections have had their issues, their questions. Looking back in history, was the right decision even made as far as who was actually the legitimate president at the time? So it's good to remember. It's good to know your history, study your history, because when somebody in a commentator status or a news status says this is the most pivotal election, this is the most scandalous, this is the worst, knowing your history helps you temper that, to understand that there have been bad times, there will be bad times, and there will be good times. And it often does come down to if people are willing to let their voices be heard, use the means with which our founding fathers have given us to make our voices heard, remove those politicians that are doing things that aren't to the best interest of the people, write the rules, fix the ship of state if needed, and move forward. And yes, there may be darker days ahead. We don't know, but it's good to remember that there have been some very interesting elections in the history of the United States.
Absolutely, absolutely. This being the first, but certainly not being the last. So Thomas Jefferson is now the President of the United States, elected in 1800 to his first term. And what does his presidency look like?
Well, one of the early things that Thomas Jefferson does, and this is something that is very important to make what we now know as the United States of America, from sea to shining sea kind of idea, that he is, and he's always been very much a fan of the French.
Yes.
And really appreciated them almost too much to the great chagrin of the Federalists, who weren't big fans of the French. And the French, with their French Revolution, were spreading ideas of anarchy and of atheism and of throwing off any kind of rule of government. And this was something that also played in the election. It was definitely batted back and forth, and that was something that Jefferson was slandered with throughout that. But with this, Jefferson does send two men, Robert R. Livingston of New York and James Monroe of Paris, who we'll be talking about later, because Monroe is the president.
That's right.
James Monroe, same guy, and they go to talk to Napoleon Bonaparte. And Bonaparte's in the middle of a war, and he needs some money, and there's a big chunk of what we now know as the United States that the French lay claim to. The way exploring worked, and one can kind of question whether this was a good idea or not, but if you kind of staked your claim at the riverhead, at the head of a river, or its outlet, which was in this case the Mississippi, you kind of got all the land that were tributaries of that. Kind of not, that's the way it worked back then.
Which of course goes all the way up to the headwaters of the Mississippi, up in the Bemidji area, and then of course the Ohio River and all of that whole expanse.
Right. And so the French have Louisiana, which we now know of, and think of this, and we call it the Louisiana Purchase, and all of this land was called Louisiana at one point.
Named after King Louis.
Right. And so this big chunk of land, these men negotiated a deal to buy it from the French for about $15 million. Which is a pretty good deal.
That's a pretty good deal. Yeah, that's pennies per square mile.
And interestingly, Mr. Livingston put, after they signed the documents, he said, "We have lived long, but this is the noblest work of our lives," as he laid his pen down. I don't think he was far off from what that was as far as the expansion of the area, the territory at this point that would be laid claim to by these small United States at this time. And of course, this was a lot of land that was the property or the areas of Native Americans that held this area. And we're, that's kind of maybe a talk for another day about land and whose land was it really. But in the history, in the time and place, this was a very big step, massively expanding.
Nearly doubled
the
landmass
of the United States. And that was a big deal. And so one of the big things Jefferson does then is get a party of exploration together, Lewis and Clark, and they go out, and it's almost like a trip to the moon in our day and age, where they go out and they don't hear from a couple of years.
Yep.
And they go out, and that's a whole other chunk of history that you can study on your own and enjoy learning about their voyage of discovery and finding out what is on the other side of all these rivers and mountains and hills, and meeting all these tribes, and bring back that information to Jefferson, who was a scientist of his day, was a naturalist, and really wanted to know what was beyond this land is moving out towards what we now know as the Pacific Ocean.
Mm-hmm. And so we have the Louisiana Purchase. We have Lewis and Clark being sent out, and a very well-known explorers, and a well-known time in American history in that sense. Anything else in his presidency of note?
Yes.
He is elected to a second term.
He is, yes. And there is interesting things. One thing that a lot of people don't know about in history was this is one of the first kind of outside war conflicts that America really gets caught up in, is the War of the Algiers, is what it's called. And it's a war against pirates in North Africa. These are Islamic pirates. They have been not just after American shipping, but most of Europe shipping has been plagued by these. They were called Barbary pirates in their day, and it was definitely a unique thing. Jefferson actually winds up getting, and I believe it's an English translation of the Quran, just to understand the mentality of these people, because it was something that he didn't really understand, and that's the reason that he has one of those in his library. But this, I won't go into a lot of detail. It's something for you to study, what the War of the Algiers was all about, but definitely interesting thing. That's why in the Marines hymn, or the Marines song, we have from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. This is the shores of Tripoli. Speaking of their, the Marines and the Navy of this fledgling United States actually do kind of put a stop to the pillaging and taking of the property of various nations in Europe, and actually are commended by many of the rulers, and I believe even the Pope actually commends this for kind of clearing the riffraff off the seas, which is kind of an interesting thing, and definitely kind of, interestingly, America's first kind of foray into conflicts with kind of Islamic powers, which is kind of an interesting thing. It's something that is more close to home nowadays, but it does show up here under Jefferson, and is something that is a little known piece of history, but worth studying a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. Very good. Jefferson is elected to his second term in 1804. He runs against Charles Pinckney, and has a massive victory this time. There's no electoral college controversy this time around. And at the end of that 8 years, he does, as was kind of exemplified by George Washington. He refuses to run for that third term, and that would, of course, stay in place for quite some time, really, until FDR.
Yes, very much. And that's, interesting that Jefferson, yes, he is popular. He is a fairly good president from all that we can see, and he does take the country in a fairly good direction. And it's interesting when you look at the campaign, how both sides with their mudslinging back and forth definitely painted him as very much a man who was more of an age of reason,
yes,
and against religion, against a lot of these things, calling him an atheist and other things, and very much boding fear for that presidency. But when you look at what he actually did, he did well for the United States.
Yeah, and it's perhaps even another one of those examples very similar to what we've seen in recent years, where what a man says and what a man does might be a little different. A man's personal loyalties versus how a man leads as president. And while Thomas Jefferson, he spent a lot of time in France during Washington's administration. I believe he was ambassador or something to that effect.
Yeah.
And then, of course, he even before the presidency, he spent a good amount of time interacting with the people and as it related to the Enlightenment. Yet he did not exercise the presidency in an Enlightenment fashion, as would have been the slings and arrows that were flung against him. And he opened himself up for that through his interactions. And yet he seemed to be able to simultaneously put a bit of a distance between maybe his own personal feelings or thoughts or explorations as it related to the nature of God and the nature of freedom and all of these things, and align himself with the position that was being asked of him at the time.
Very much so.
What else?
So I think one thing to maybe touch on, and this is outside of Jefferson, but it does tie in, as we talked about with Jefferson's election, is the eventual duel and the death of Alexander Hamilton and the duel between him and Aaron Burr. It's an interesting time, and we start to see this, and I'm going to highlight as we go on several times throughout this history of a fledgling United States, how public opinion starts to turn against certain things that were seen as commonplace and almost normal. And this particular one is actually one of the beginnings of the eventual abolishing of dueling. It was something that was kind of, not necessarily 100% okay in every place, but it was something that was seen of as a gentlemanly way to handle an argument, to handle a slight. And really the history behind this, as we kind of laid out, was Burr was very much kind of smarted, was hurt by the way Hamilton had treated him in this presidential election. Burr, who had gone in, he was going to be vice president, got that close to the presidency, and Hamilton shot him down. Well, that's
figuratively
not,
at this point.
Figuratively, yes. Good point.
better distinguished in this conversation.
Very funny. Good point. But he actually, Hamilton also kind of ruins Burr's hopes to be governor of New York as well. And he kind of is, they're rivals in that sense. And Hamilton, while in private life, had actually loaned Burr a substantial sum of money when Burr was in need and was fairly kind to him in that regard. There was definitely deep animosity between the two of them in a political sense. And Hamilton was, in a sense, a bit of a spoiler to Burr's loftier ideas of holding different public offices. And this kind of comes to a head in the duel between Hamilton and Burr. And as we know from history, Burr winds up killing Hamilton in this duel. There's varying accounts, but it's pretty clear that Hamilton, while going through with it, was not really intending any harm to Burr. And it does wind up that Burr, while he gets a revenge of sorts, this definitely divides the moral senses of the nation. And there is a huge outcry from the nation at the loss of what was probably one of the brightest stars of from the Revolution, of the Founding Fathers, And he was a mover shaker type in politics, and probably would have been a president at some
Yep.
point if he had lived. And so Hamilton's life being cut short really starts to galvanize in people's minds a moral aversion and a moral anger, kind of a righteous indignation against dueling and some of these things that were holdovers from kind of more feudal times. And it really starts to change public opinion where it wasn't looked on favorably if you were to engage in such practices. And it's interesting to see that something like this definitely shifts and begins to shift people's idea of what is right and wrong within a nation. And that, we've talked about in talking about how the Declaration of Independence, how the Constitution was framed, how there is a progression throughout history and throughout American history of people really seeing things that maybe before weren't seen as great wrongs, become more and more obvious as something that is wrong and that should be eliminated from society.
Yeah, and of course we talked about this a little bit last time when we were considering George Washington and the nature of him owning slaves, and of course Thomas Jefferson as well was a slave owner, and the first many presidents were slave owners. And as we think through that concept, and we think through even this concept, the moral sensibilities of a people changing, and the nature of progression over time, where we see something which we would today call barbaric, is actually something which at the time was acceptable. And that transformation is very important for us to consider, to remember that it's quite likely that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, if God is gracious and this nation persists, they will look back upon us and see the same type of barbarism in our day in various ways. Maybe not as a whole, and the fight is on, of course, but I would imagine that with everything that science is telling, combined with, of course, what the Word of God says, there might very well, depending on how things go, there might be a generation that wholesale sees abortion as the barbarism that it is. And the history books might look back and see that for what it is, and see the barbarism of it, and question how is it that a people could imagine that would be okay, while simultaneously thinking themselves to be an enlightened people or whatever it might be. And so we have throughout time this ebb and this flow. And of course, that ebb and that flow, when rooted in the Word of God, becomes an anchor and not an ebb and a flow. And yet, society comes through this process of ebbing and flowing from traditions and the push of the Word of God and the power of the Word of God, and then flowing away from that into various other sensibilities and ideologies. We even see this between Enlightenment thinking and Reformation thinking. And here we find another good instance of such a thing, where sometimes it takes a stunning or a stirring event for the sensibilities of a people to be galvanized toward an end. And whether for better or worse, I not necessarily speaking to each of these decisions as to whether or not it was a good thing or a bad thing, save that as we look through history, we need to be careful that we don't get so enthusiastic about judging the previous times against our own or against our own sensibilities, and understand how it is that these things change over time, and recognize that the nature of cultures and of traditions and of carryovers from other cultures means that things aren't always going to be clear-cut. And that the moral sensibilities of one generation are not always the moral sensibilities of another.
Very well put.
Anything else to cover with Thomas Jefferson?
I think that's pretty much what I had.
Very good.
I think if there's anything else, I think it's interesting to look at this man. And he is a different sort of president than these first two that we talked about. He's a quiet, one might say even a bit more of a humble, plain type man, even though he if you have seen any pictures, or if you know what Monticello looks like, Jefferson's home, he wasn't a very he was well off. He was very well off.
Yes.
But lived a very plain and simple life, and this was something that as a president he wanted to he didn't want to have all the pomp and the show that Washington and others put in, that and for their part felt like that was necessary to give a sense of dignity and honor to the United States. It wasn't necessarily their honor they were seeking, it was to elevate the position. And it is interesting that over time we have had various presidents who have either gravitated more towards kind of the pomp and the show of the office, and others who have kind of shrunk from that. And it's also an interesting thing that he is the kind of the first president to preside over a government in Washington. It moves from Philadelphia to Washington at that time. Yes, John Adams did live in the White House, or what was being built as the White House, for a while. But when the actual government technically moves to Washington, this is the first inauguration that's held in Washington, things are beginning to change a little bit. It's kind of weird that they built Washington in the middle of a swamp, but it was...
which is probably why Maryland was more than happy to donate the land, right?
Probably, and it is funny that some might still say there's quite a bit of swamp there, but that there's a change. There's definitely a change and a growth.
Yes.
A little bit of a coming of age of the United States, and that will continue as we begin to see things change, and as we move on. There are definite good steps and good changes within the country during this time, but there's definitely still rumblings going on, and in our next podcast, as we talk about James Madison and others, things definitely come to a head with the War of 1812 and other things. So there's definitely things going on in the world politics that definitely will come to a head. But Jefferson, as a man and as a president, was definitely one that will be looked on kindly and should be as what he did, and it's been an interesting thing studying him. So, like I said before, dig in, study the actual election of 1800. Very interesting. Study a little bit about Lewis and Clark and the Louisiana Purchase. Another interesting to study, and the War of the Algiers. All of those are very interesting things to study, and I think you will be well rewarded and broaden your understanding of this time of a fledgling little nation kind of learning how to walk, getting its feet under it, and really kind of finding its place on the stage of nations.
Very good. Well, that will do it for us today. This has been the Wright County Restoration Project. And we, of course, are always happy to have you like, subscribe, comment. If you have any questions, concerns, interests of note, WCRP, that's Wright County Restoration Project, WCRP at legacybaptistchurch.net. Send those things along, and we'd be happy to address them in turn. And we'll hope to see you next time. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching Wright County Restoration Project podcast.